Richard Tremblay is Emeritus Professor of Public Health at the University College Dublin in Ireland and Emeritus Professor of Pediatrics and Psychology at the University of Montreal and Director of the Canadian Centre of Excellence on Early Child Development. Like our previous speaker, he received the highest distinction for research in criminology, the Stockholm Prize, in 2017. The award recognized Professor Tremblay as the leading scholar in the world in developing basic science connections between biological, family, and social factors in human development. The recognition went on. He combines this research with rigorous tests of policies that may alter these factors to reduce crime and violence. The jury who awarded the prize took special note of his success in drawing connections across many different scientific disciplines as well as philosophy in the tradition of the great scientist who sought to build connections rather than walls between disciplines. I also want to acknowledge Dr. Tremblay's role in the organizing committee and his help in publicizing the event. So I ask you to please join me in welcoming Professor Richard Tremblay.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks. Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you for inviting me to this wonderful conference. Okay, I thought I needed this. Okay, so the focus of my talk is on sex differences of physical aggression and on an intergenerational perspective. And as you will see, there is an important link with what you've just heard. Nelson Mandela wrote the foreword to the World Health Organization report on violence and health, published in 2002. And in his foreword, he wrote, "We must address the roots of violence. Only then will we transform the past century's legacy from a crushing burden into a cautionary lesson." He was essentially repeating what Aristotle said 2,300 years ago, he who considers things in their first growth and origins, the roots, will obtain the clearest view of them. I started at the wrong place. At the bottom here, in 1970, I went to work in a prison. It was a mental health prison for mentally ill offenders. And I worked there, loved it for 3 years, but realized that I would spend the rest of my life in prison if I continued there. So I went backwards to work on juvenile delinquency, did my thesis on the treatment of juvenile delinquents, and sometimes later realized that I should be working at the problem earlier. So I work with kindergarten children, and that's where we started our first longitudinal studies that I'll talk about. And eventually, in doing that work, I realized that kindergarten was too late and that we should start with birth. And so we work from birth onwards. And I'm so glad that David was talking before me, because after almost 50 years of work, I realized, well, David is doing the right thing that I should have been doing all this time. And so my talk will be essentially giving you an idea of why we need to start where David started. And it all starts with what I've called the developmental black hole. We take a developmental approach, and Adolf Ketley, who was a mathematician, astronomer, published in 1831 his work on the development of behavior problems, the development of the cognitive development, and physical development. Adolf Ketley is the one who invented the body mass index in studying physical development, and in studying moral development, he created the age crime curve with data from prisons in France. I call it the developmental black hole because the peak of the age crime curve is where all the attention is put on. They are doing the worst things that we want to get rid of, but we're focused on it. And most of criminological research has been focused on the age crime curve and the peak of the age crime curve. The panel, this is an example of the thinking in criminology. The panel on understanding and control of violent behavior, which was set up by the US National Academy of Sciences in the late 1980s. And their report, one conclusion was that modern psychological perspective emphasized that aggressive and violent behaviors are learned responses to frustration, that they can also be learned as an instrument for achieving goals, and that the learning occurs by observing models of such behavior. Such models may be observed in the family, among peers, elsewhere in the neighborhood, through the mass media. We learn to aggress, and we reach the peak during adolescence, late adolescence. Same idea from the World Health Organization report on violence and health in 2002. The majority of young people who become violent are adolescent limited offenders who, in fact, show little or no evidence of high levels of aggression or other problem behaviors during their childhood. And that was, in fact, a citation from the Youth Violence Report of the Surgeon General here in the United States that had been published a year earlier. These ideas were explained very simply at the beginning of the book by Jean-Jacques Rousseau on education. God makes all things good, man meddles with them, and they become evil. We are born good, and we learn to do all these bad things. With a number of longitudinal studies, and this one is on a random sample of the population in the province of Quebec in Canada, we've been trying to monitor this learning of bad behavior. And this is one of the results where, since I'll be focusing on the difference between males and females, we can see these differences. Now, we have 4 types of behaviors here, 2 types of aggression, physical aggression, and indirect aggression. And we have proactive aggression, you aggress others, you take the initiative, or reactive aggression. With I will not get into the statistical detail, but with what we call trajectory analyses, we have been looking at how many different types of development there are, and to what extent there are differences between males and females. And if you look at the first column, group 1, this is a group, 26% of all the boys and girls who show 0 physical aggression, indirect aggression, and obviously no proactive and reactive aggression. 26% of the sample, and not surprisingly, 76% of them are females. Second group, another group that almost doesn't show any aggression. The aggression that they show is indirect aggression. And again, we are with a group that is a majority of girls. The third group, here is a majority of boys, and you can see that they show some physical aggression. There is some increase in indirect aggression from 6 to 12 years of age and then decreasing. And in terms of reactive aggression, there is an important decrease over time. The fourth group is a group where we have the action. This is 7% of the sample. They are a majority of girls, and they were high on physical aggression, indirect aggression, proactive aggression, reactive aggression from 6 years of age, and with age it's decreasing. Finally, the last group, a majority of males, 5%, and 84% of them are males. It's 5% of the sample, and you can see that their levels of physical aggression, indirect aggression, proactive aggression, reactive aggression are stable from age 6 to age 13. So no learning of aggression. What they are learning is not to aggress. Let's focus on the boys who have chronic physical aggression. What happens to them in the long run? They fail in school, they use and abuse tobacco, alcohol, drugs, they have early sex, violence, depression, unemployment, poverty. For the moment, just think about what type of fathers do they become. Let's go to girls. The girls, they're a minority, but there are girls with chronic physical aggression, and especially those who have hyperactivity problems. they go on to tobacco use, school failure, early sex, partner aggression, depression, teenage pregnancy, welfare. What kind of mother do they become? So remember Mandela, to understand how to prevent the chronic trajectories of aggression, we must address the roots. And we see that it decreases with age. So after having done part of that work, I decided let's start at birth and follow children from early childhood. And so we've been following a large representative sample of children born in the province of Quebec from birth. And what do we see when we start early on? To the right, it's a boy. To the left, it's a girl. And the boy on the right is the grandson of one of my good friends. The mother took the picture. The grandfather sent me the picture and said, look, my grandson is doing what you're interested in. And the mother, I asked her, can I use this picture for my talks? And she said, yes, at one condition. You have to say he was only defending himself. So when you aggress, the mother really defends you. You're only defending yourself. Now, if we've done the right connection, you should be seeing a video of aggression now.
Violemment. Maxime ne veut pas partager ses jouets. Aujourd'hui, à Dr Nadia, psychologue à domicile.
Ça se résume souvent par une claque. Il est assis sur quelque chose, il pousse, il le jette à terre. C'est assez violent comme conflit quand ça éclate. Puis il élève le ton. Comment vous intervenez quand il y a un conflit?
Now, you don't have to understand French to understand what's going on. So this is a 3-year-old, 3.5-year-old, and a 2-year-old, brothers. I showed this video because I always have the impression people don't understand what I'm talking about when I'm talking about early aggression. It's really physical aggression, and it's serious. And the place in life where you're more at risk of being attacked, physically attacked, is in daycare at age 2 and 3. It can't be worse. Okay, so trajectories of physical aggression from 17 months up to 14 years of age. So let's look at the girls first and start by the left part of the slide. You can see that there is a group of girls, and that's self-report. The third part there to the right is self-report. You can see that there is a group of girls that are reporting physical aggression from age 10. I'm sorry, I don't see it very well written here. And if we go backwards to the left, we look at teacher reports, and the teacher are reporting high physical aggression for those girls. So there is confirmation of the behavior that was self-reported by the teachers in elementary school. And you can see that in early childhood, the same group of girls were reported by their parents as showing high physical aggression. So there is confirmation from age 17 months to late adolescence with 3 different observers that we can recognize these girls have been aggressive from early childhood until adolescence. If we look at the boys now, we see the same thing. Self-reports are confirmed by teacher reports during elementary school. Where it doesn't confirm is that we see that the red line, the boys do not appear to be the highest in aggression during early childhood. And we're not too sure why this is. One possibility is that the mothers of these boys are underreporting, or there may be some kind of late onset of physical aggression for the most aggressive during early childhood. The age crime curve is a black hole that detracts us from the roots in the sense that there is the peak in aggression is in early childhood. And I want to stress that this aggression is important aggression. And the person who understood this and wrote it first is St. Augustine, 400 years BC. It is not the infant's will that is harmless, but the weakness of infant limbs. And I like to say the aggressive 2-year-old, you can tolerate him to a certain extent. If you put him to bed at night and he wakes up in the morning 6 feet tall, you will put him in prison. What they are doing is tolerable because of the weakness of their limbs. And they need help. Otherwise, they will end up in prison. The other problem with aggression in early childhood not being taken very seriously was written by Jerry Keegan, a famous psychologist at Harvard. In 1974, he was saying a young child cannot be aggressive until he has some psychic intention of injuring another. Aggressive behavior, as we have defined it, does not occur with any frequency until well into the 2nd year. Well, Jerry was wrong. It happens before the 2nd year, and you don't need to have intention. We show it very, very clearly with these trajectories. At 17 months, those who are using physical aggression the most are those who will be using it the most over time. So the conclusions from longitudinal studies of early childhood to early adulthood are that humans do not learn to physically aggress. they learn not to physically aggress. Chronic physical aggression is very rarely late onset. This appears to be true for other behavior problems, such as stealing and destruction of property. A lot of stealing and a lot of destruction of property around age 2. Boys are more likely than girls to frequently use physical aggression. Physically aggressive boys and girls are at high risk of numerous long-term biopsychosocial problems. Now let's focus on the mechanisms. Which mechanisms should be targeted? Genetic factors, environmental factors that moderate genetic effects, environmental effects on gene expression, others. Although these questions may be perceived as modern, when we use modern words, they were relatively clearly formulated in the past. The original sin hypothesis, according to Erasmus. We should be especially careful with our children during their first years, for at this stage, their behavior is guided by instinct more than by reason, so that they are inclined equally to good and evil, more to the latter, perhaps, and it is always easier to forget good habits than to learn bad ones. This truth was already known to pagan philosophers and caused them great perplexity. But their speculations were unable to penetrate the real cause, and it was left to Christian theology to teach the truth that since Adam, the first man of the human race, a disposition to evil has been deeply ingrained in us. Well, evil ingrained in us, we're talking about genetics. While this is indisputably man's condition, however, we cannot deny that the greater portion of this evil stems from corrupting relationships and misguided education, especially as they affect our early and most impressionable years. That's the environment. And what Rousseau did later was throw out genetics and throw out the original sin and say it's only the environment. So the debate, environment, genetics, has been there for a very long time. And let's take Thomas Hobbes a century later. Unless you give infants everything they want, they cry and get angry, they even beat their own parents. Thus, an evil man is rather like a sturdy boy, or a man of childish mind, and evil is simply want of reason at an age when it normally accrues to men. By nature, genes, governed by discipline, the brain, and experience of harm, the environment. Hobbes said it all. And Rousseau's reaction, which spread like wildfire, it's not my fault, it's the environment. It's much easier to believe that it's the environment than to believe that it's something within us. Whether we call it sin, original sin, or genetics. So let's look at genetic factors. We use twins to look at genetic factors, and in the US you have this famous twin couple. They are monozygotic twins, and one was sent into space, the other stayed on the ground. And amazingly, I don't know if you've seen it, but Science published a paper on analysis of the differences between going into space and staying on the ground. And I think it's the longest paper Science ever published. And it's on an N of one couple of twins, published by Science. Every aspect of their behavior, of their physiology was compared. It's a marvelous paper. But we're not astronauts, and we have to use more twins for us to be able to publish in papers. So we've been following a large sample of twins, and the first results that we got, we were very surprised to see. We compared physical aggression, to what extent there is a genetic effect on physical aggression at 20 months of age, and to what extent there is a genetic effect on vocabulary, the number of words used. And the genetic effect is stronger for physical aggression at 20 months of age than for the number of words you used. So there is a strong genetic effect on the use of physical aggression, and from very early on. As we followed these twins over time, we showed that the genetic factors explain from 50% to 62% of the variance in frequency of physical aggression, that the genetic effects observed at 20 months substantially decreased over time, while new genetic effects appeared at 32 and 50 months. So gene effects vary with time, and two separate sets of uncorrelated genetic factors accounted for the variation in initial level and change over time. And there were no sex differences in terms of the role genes play in the expression of physical aggression. The role of friends with twins shows that there is an interaction between genes and environment, that the more you have the aggressive genes, the more you are likely to be influenced by your peers that are aggressive. And surprisingly, this is happening early on in first grade, but later on there is no more of an effect of the environment, and probably because by that time you are selecting the children you want to interact with, and you are selecting aggressive individuals. Now let's switch to epigenetics. For those who don't know what we're talking about when we're talking of epigenetics in terms of gene expression, think of a piano. Genes are like the piano keys, okay? You can't hear any sound from piano keys if you don't have someone that's activating the keys. So epigenetics is factors that turn on and off genes, like piano keys. I think that the most important paper that came out in on epigenetics with reference to parenting is this paper that was published in 2004. And it's a paper that was published by colleagues at the university, at McGill University, Moishe Schiff and Michael Meany. And as soon before publications, we had a meeting, and we immediately agreed, seeing these results, that we should be doing this type of study on aggression. The study here is showing, I guess, essentially what David Olds has been trying to do. And it's the rat mother that is licking her pups enough is making them live longer. The more, if you are a rat pup and your mother licks well enough, you will live longer than if you have a mother that doesn't lick you enough. And so this is a good model for the care that children need, and the care that we need should be observed in terms of epigenetic effects. What we see with chronically aggressive children as they become adults, we've seen that they have, the males have 448 distinct gene promoters that were differently methylated when we compared them to boys who were not chronically aggressive. And we saw the same results for females. 430 distinct gene promoters were differently methylated. And so we are seeing similarities and differences between males and females, but there is clearly an important epigenetic differences between aggressive and non-aggressive males and females, chronically aggressive. And we also showed associations between brain serotonin synthesis and DNA methylation. In this study of environmental risk oxytocin receptor gene, what I was talking about in the previous slides were not longitudinal results concerning epigenetics, but in this study that was done by Barker and his colleagues, they showed that there was higher maternal psychopathology, criminal behavior, substance use was associated with higher oxytocin receptor gene methylation at birth. And oxytocin methylation at birth was also associated with higher callous unemotional traits at age 13. Okay, so that's for genetics and epigenetics. Now let's look at environmental effects. This is a slide from the Netherlands, where there is a tradition of saying concerning education, the way you hear it is the way you sing it. And I'm translating this with this Hydra phenomena. The best early environmental predictors of chronic physical aggression in the work that we've been doing is maternal low education, poverty, maternal anger, maternal depression, maternal stress, maternal antisocial behavior, maternal smoking, teenage pregnancy, and poor marital relations. I think that you've realized that there was no paternal there. There's maternal, maternal, maternal. And I've called that the Hydra phenomena. Hydra is the animal that was supposed to be killed, and if you try to kill this animal, you have to cut all the heads. Cutting one head, it will grow up. And I think that's the task that most of you who are working with families have. Some researchers will say you should target that, others will say you should target that, others will say research is saying that, but it's all these phenomena that we have to tackle. This is a slide just to remind me to tell you that that phenomena is linked to mating. The study here I am showing is a study of almost a whole population in Sweden, looking at assortative mating, and there is a strong assortative mating in terms of mental problems. People who have mental problems mate with people who have mental health problems, okay? So you put genetic mental health problems, genetics, you mate, and so obviously the children inherit mental health problems. And again, the Hydra challenge is to cut all these heads, is to address all these problems. And the way I'm trying to explain this here is that you have a girl who has low self-control, school failure, depression, tobacco abuse, delinquency, early sex, partner abuse. She becomes pregnant with a male that has similar problems. This creates gene expression problems. This creates brain development problems, and it leads to behavior problems. A very good example of where we should start is the talk that you have just heard. And since 2010, since I read that paper and saw that the effects were greater on females than on males, I said, my God, this is wonderful. If the mothers are helped, the girls will become mothers. We are helping the mothers. Their girls are being helped, so they will become better mothers, and the better mothers will help the males. And so the way to change things in the long run is not to try to impact the males, who appear to be harder to impact, but impacting females so that in the long run we have better mothers. And I was surprised that David did not talk about the epigenetic analysis that was done on their work, but there is a publication showing that the nurse visitation program is having an impact on gene expression. So not only are we changing behavior, but changing gene expression. And if you change gene expression over generations, you will have big impacts in the long run. Again, as you've understood by now, I like to go back to history because we always think that this is new. The lessons are there in history. And I discovered this book that was published by the World Health Organization. It was, in fact, the first book that they published in 1951 by a Swiss psychiatrist, Lucien Beauvais, who was exactly saying that we should be focusing much more on the delinquent girl than the delinquent males, because if we help the delinquent girls, we will change things in the next generation. They will select better mates, and they will provide better care to their family, to their children. David Barker wrote the following in 2002. Chronic diseases are not the inevitable lot of humankind. We could readily prevent them had we the will to do so. Many babies in the womb in the Western world today are receiving unbalanced and inadequate diets. Protecting the nutrition and health of girls and young women should be the cornerstone of public health. Not only will this prevent chronic disease, but it will produce new generations who have better health and well-being throughout life. Now, David Barker was interested mainly in the obesity problem, but it's clear that he is talking about all the health problems, including mental health, which includes violence problems. The intergenerational continuum of adverse environment and chronic physical aggression mediated by DNA methylation is a good example of having to start early in life. And one person who said it very simply, it's the chief of the Soli people in Zambia. When you educate a man, an individual is educated. When you educate a woman, you educate her children and thus the nation. Thank you. There is a question that you asked that we address at the end of our talk. I don't know if every person has done this. Maybe you don't remember. I got this message from Paul. The core issue behind this conference, what early factors might explain why males are more violent than females. And so your question was, what early factors might explain why males are more violent than females? I just want to say that Charles Darwin is probably the one who best answered, and it's sexual selection. And I just want to show images of what we mean by sexual selection, so that it stays in your mind that humans from evolution inherited differences. You can see that women and males in terms of size, body size, and muscles are very different. And it's not an accident that this happens, that we have bigger muscles and size. And it starts back far in evolution, but I've taken two examples. The male walrus has to fight to have his genes in the next generation. And while the males are fighting, the females are taking care of the children. Same thing with the buffalo. They fight to have access to the females to reproduce themselves, and it's winner takes all. So the genes of the winner is spread in a larger group. It's not like that among humans. It's much less like that among humans, but we have kept similarities. Okay.
So are you suggesting we throw the male under the bus?
Males need good mothering to become good fathers.
And not good fathering. That doesn't matter.
Sorry?
It doesn't matter whether they get good fathering.
Yeah, sure it matters. But I think in terms of intervention, the choice that David made in terms of helping the girls that had more need of it are the best choice that can be made. And it needs, I think he clearly said it, that stopping at 2 years of age is probably not the optimum, and so that we need to continue to give support over time. But starting during adolescence and pregnancy with girls who have problems, I think is the best strategy in the long run.
A question. I'll play devil's
Hi, Sarah.
advocate to your point. One could argue that improvements in access to education, particularly for people from low-income backgrounds, have disproportionately benefited girls relative to boys, and that girls have outpaced boys in terms of educational attainment and in terms of labor force outcomes, and that an inadvertent result of that has been an increase in violence and a sense of alienation and a sense of anger among young men who feel left behind. And so I'm wondering if you could comment on that with respect to the solution that focusing on women will have a trickle-down effect in terms of benefiting boys.
Yes. Well, one generation is. I'm not saying we should not do anything with boys. I'm saying, I guess, that the priority should be the girls who are at risk and will eventually have children. And it's a matter of the amount of resource that we have. I haven't done and I haven't seen any good data on how much investment is made on males with problems and females with problems. But my impression, if we look at the amount of resources that are put in incarcerating males, in all the services that are given to males because they are scary, they create more problems. My impression is that girls are less well off in terms of services than males. I remember, it must be about 30 years ago, we did a very rapid analysis of the resources that were given in residential centers for boys and for girls. And the boys were getting almost twice the budget of the girls. And when you ask us why is that, it was, well, the boys are creating much more problem than the girls, so we are giving much more to the boys. And so my impression is that we need to reverse that in a substantial way so that we will not, it's not the short-term impacts here that we need to look at, it's the long-term impacts, and the long-term impacts need to be intergenerational. And that's why yesterday I asked the question to Elizabeth Cunningham concerning the experiment that they did with adolescents, is to what extent are we following them in the next generation? That is, are we having an impact on the mates that they are choosing, on the children that they are having, so that we understand to what extent the interventions are paying off. The short-term evaluations, I don't think, are telling us anything about the long-term results of the interventions we are doing.
I have a question related to, I'm over here. That was one of my questions coming to this conference, thinking about, are we better off investing more for boys? Are we better off investing more in bringing dads in and supporting dads? Or are we better off investing more our resources in helping their mothers become more nurturing and responsive to their needs? And in our state, we've spent a significant amount of money on fatherhood initiatives and have not really had a lot of good outcomes from that, other than a lot of dads getting connected to jobs, which I guess you could sort of pull that apart and see, good outcomes related to the family. But we're not seeing outcomes in terms of decreasing behavior problems for boys in school. We're still getting high numbers of boys getting expelled from preschool for aggressive behaviors, most of it externalizing behaviors. So I guess my question to you is sort of from a criminologist perspective, do we have any data that tells us that males who commit violent crime, what their family structures were, whether there were fathers involved, whether there weren't, and beyond that, do we have data that sort of has sort of a qualitative look at what their experience of being mothering looked like, so that we could sort of differentiate between, we have a lot of examples of very successful, individuals who came from very adverse beginnings who were raised by single mothers. And, you know, you can look at that from a resilience perspective and kind of, you know, learn from that. But is it really more meaningful than just that?
Yeah. Well, I guess there are a number of answers to that. The question of do we have data on boys that had problems and what happened in the long run with in relationship to fathers. From our longitudinal studies, where we start from children very young onwards, and we try to get as much data as we can from the mothers and from the fathers, and we try to study the mothers and the fathers. It's clear that most of the data is coming from the mothers, that it's very hard to get data from the fathers because they are not there, they're not interested, they come and they go, they leave the child and don't stay when you ask them to stay and answer questionnaires. My impression is that the males are much harder to help, and that in the long run, it's better to help the girls, and their sons will be more helpful if we have helped the sons. So I'm being told to wrap up, and my conclusion is let's put more resources to girls. David has shown us the way, and the work that David has been doing, it's great that it's spreading, and it should be spreading more and more. And let's continue to help these families. The work that David is doing has stopped at age 2. We need to continue and help these families in the long run. Thank you.